Thanks again for that wonderful introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about modern day web development. Okay, so one thing's obviously always true, trends always change, and website trends have obviously definitely changed over time. So I've been working in digital for quite some time. I've seen the web evolve quite substantially. One thing that's always been true and always been a pillar to digital success, I guess, has been user experience. Google's always centered itself around focusing its value around the user. And we can actually see this with Google's algorithm updates over time. So back in 2015, Google introduced RankBrain, which is an algorithm update that Google started to focus around what's the user doing? Can we kind of shift the way we're presenting our results based on what users are doing on websites and how they're interacting with the search results? That was a touch in the ocean, I guess you could call it. More recently, last year, Google introduced the page experience update, which was totally centered around user experience. They introduced a new tool called Google Lighthouse, and Google Lighthouse audits how the experience that users are having on your website. It looks at things like performance and usability and accessibility. So I'm going to talk to you about these 5 kind of key areas that I believe you should be looking at when kind of building or maintaining a modern day website. And along the way, I'm going to touch on a few various other kind of topics that I just want to kind of introduce you to if you're not familiar to, I guess. And I guess where I'm trying to go with this at the end is that when we get to full circle, is that a progressive web app almost encompasses all these kind of five areas. So I'm going to talk about Headless, and if you're not familiar with what Headless is, I'm going to kind of touch on that and a way to kind of build modern day websites that are really performant. It wouldn't be a talk about modern day web tech if I didn't speak about mobile and responsive web design. JavaScript, which can be a bit of an intimidating topic for a lot of people that are kind of very technical. But we're going to talk about how JavaScript's evolved to build very modern, performant websites. And then when we come full circle, we're going to talk about progressive web apps, or PWAs as they like to be referred to. PWAs are essentially a way, or a list of criteria rather, that Google kind of looks at to ensure that your website kind of encompasses all these kind of areas, I guess. So we'll get into it, performance. So there's so many stats around how performance relates to business performance from a digital standpoint, I guess. Throughout my career, I've always seen correlations to, website performance, website speed, better SEO, more traffic, more conversions. And this has particularly become really true in the last 2 years, I would say. We run a tool, an internal tool at Indago called Indago, and we do a lot of analysis around this. This is just a snapshot out of one of them, and this is always the case whenever we correlate website performance to ranking position. So we audit websites that rank for keywords that our clients want to be listed for, I guess, and a very big scale. And you always see this S-bend when you intersect performance score and ranking position. So it's very interesting to see this kind of evolve over time. And it's definitely the way Google's kind of going with it. Responsive web design. So I think the latest stat that I looked at from Statistio was 57% of total online traffic globally was coming from mobile. Google actually, maybe in the last 5 years, has changed the way it evaluates websites from at least an organic perspective. It almost, prior to that, it almost just looked at your website through the lens of mobile and desktop. Didn't matter the device didn't matter. Now Google actually separates the way it looks at your website, at least from an index perspective. It will evaluate your website totally differently based on around what it sees from a mobile device or a desktop device, and it actually keeps two separate indexes. We know that speed is obviously a bigger factor when it comes to mobile. That's obviously because of connectivity issues, but obviously the power of the devices that are kind of driving these websites. I don't think this will be a massive. This will decline over time as internet connections get better and devices get more powerful. And I think the key thing here is that are you measuring what your mobile traffic is doing through your Google Analytics or equivalent? And I think what I kind of see, what I have seen in my career is that I tend to just draw a line on mobile and sort of say, here's mobile, here's desktop, and this is what it's doing in terms of your conversion rates, or it might be your engagement. But what I want to kind of encourage is that you go away and have a look at your statistics in a much more granular fashion. So look at it by device, look at it by vendor, look at it by various different screen sizes. Because the thing that you need to keep in mind, obviously, is, and just remind everyone that there are hundreds of different types of devices that out there, in various different sizes, platforms, technologies, right? And what a lot of people might not realize is that your website could look totally different across these. Most of the case, not the case, but it's a possibility. You definitely want to be segmenting that out as much as possible. And testing is a big thing, right? So what can you do to test your website on these various different devices? How is your website conforming to the various different screen sizes, landscape, portrait, tablet, and so forth? And what's actually being presented to the user? If you're designing a website or you're designing pages, I think you need to be considering it from a mobile-first perspective these days. That's a given. The other big thing that I think has kind of been mislooked at more recently, just because of the way mobile has kind of taken off, is how does your CMS, your content management system, wherever you're entering your content into, right, allow you to tailor your content and experience based on device or based on the width of your viewport? Do you have options to hide content if it is on a mobile or desktop, because you might think your users might be to overload, or what customizations can you do? Really kind of think about how what functionality can you put into your CMS that might be able to tailor your how you deliver your content on device. And we'll talk about PWAs later on, but essentially PWAs are kind of aimed towards more mobile, more mobile centric. Site architecture. So I've seen a lot of movement in this area over the past few years, and particularly around how we're structuring websites from a content perspective. Definitely see that websites that are well organized, well architected, definitely perform better from a usability standpoint, right? Making your content more accessible, more findable, right, is obviously going to be a good thing. Thinking about how your navigation is structured, but even past that, how people can search for content in various different ways they might be able to find content. And testing, your user flows, how people are finding that content. Where are they clicking from? Where are they coming in from? Where are they coming out from? Are there any kind of bottlenecks in the journey in terms of finding that content? Really pinpointing those and alleviating those bottlenecks. And the other really big thing is trying to use SEO data around structuring the pillars around your content, right? So typically SEO is aimed around ranking for a cluster of keywords or a particular keyword or various different topics, and looking at that data in terms of how users are searching for it and structuring your website based around that, or at least factoring it in, right, can have a massive advantage around not only ranking higher in Google, but also getting into the mindset of your users and how they might be searching for your content. So what you're looking at here is a Google Trends chart. I'm willing to bet that if you own or operate a website, that it is probably running on something, WordPress or something alike, right? I'm sure everyone would understand what WordPress is. It's a content management system, very available and been around for a very long time. And that's that yellow line there. But what I want to kind of talk about is this explosion of these JavaScript frameworks that seems to be taking over, and almost, if you look more recently, React, which is one of them, is almost about to surpass WordPress, right? And there seems to be definitely a trend moving forward with the way developers are building websites. So I come from a development background. I understand these kind of frameworks quite well, but essentially what they are is they are frameworks that allow developers to build very interactive websites relatively quickly and efficiently, right? They're very powerful, and they're actually backed by some of, they're backed by big companies. So React is, Facebook or Meta based, and AngularJS is a Google product, right? Back when these frameworks started to kind of come about and developers started to adopt them, there was a massive explosion, but there was actually a bottleneck. JavaScript alone is very bad for SEO. Well, not bad for SEO, but difficult. Google can't actually, in most cases, or back then anyways, couldn't really read JavaScript or kind of index it. But more recently, these additional tools have come out, Gatsby and Next.js, and there are various others, but these are the two more popular ones that allow you to build what's called headless websites. And headless basically allows you to kind of encompass the advantages of the JavaScript frameworks and make them very SEO friendly, make them very fast, and kind of make them very compliant for the web, right? And since these tools have kind of come out, there's been a massive explosion around the adoption around trying to build more of these headless type websites rather than something more traditional that you might be familiar with, something like WordPress, which in my experience has always been very slow and clunky. Not to say that you can't build a great WordPress website, just a lot more difficult, I guess. But essentially what headless, it changes the way websites work. You almost move all your back end and your front end totally separated, whereas WordPress, it's all kind of, WordPress alike, it's all kind of encapsulated in the one system. And what you build, or what the developer builds, is this API that connects the two, right? And the tools there, Gatsby and Next.js, allow you to do that. They give you the tools to do that. So PWA is a fairly big topic. I'm going to try and touch on it. The animation's working. So list of kind of criteria or rules that Google will need to be fulfilled to kind of officially say that your website is a PWA, right? And Google evaluates this based on these kind of features and more. But we'll kind of talk about them, and then hopefully there's some questions later on that I can kind of help clear up. So we spoke about mobile. If you have a PWA website, it needs to be fully responsive. I'm sure most websites today are. One of the key differences with a PWA that might be a bit surprising is that it needs to be able to work offline. All right. And sorry, the thing I forgot to mention before I started this slide was that essentially a PWA tries to fill the void that a traditional mobile app might, right? But just on a website, if that makes sense. We're trying to kind of give you that app-like feeling, right, on a website. And I actually think that give it a few more years, traditional native apps may start to kind of take a bit of a decline, and PWAs may become much more popular only because of the discoverability aspect. When you think about really, you only have one way to discover, not one way, but the traditional way to discover a mobile native app is through an app store, a Google Play or an Apple Store, whereas a website's much more discoverable. You have an address, you have you can be found on Google and so forth. But sorry, going back to this, so works offline is really important. So if you think about a native app, right, they do work offline. You do expect it to work without an internet connection. It's what your website needs to do to be PWA compliant. So it's a way to kind of tell the website, well, what do I do? What do I show the user when I don't have an internet connection? What can we do with this? It needs to have app-like interface. So you'll tend to find that it won't have the address bar when it's viewed on a mobile. It's very kind of app-like. Push notifications. Our websites, you can see nowadays, websites do have push notifications. You can opt in for them, but to have a PWA, you need to be able to kind of provide that functionality. They do self-update just naturally as a website does, right? So you don't expect to update a website when you view it. They're much more discoverable than a native app, but the other key thing is that they are installable. So if you've come across, because these have taken off, and you probably have, some of you may have seen these while kind of viewing websites. There will be, if you're on a PWA, you'll know it because it'll ask you if you want to install it. When you accept that, it puts a desktop on, an icon on your desktop, all right? Which allows the user to obviously come back to that website or app, if you will, right, and continue the journey. And actually, the adoption has become much better recent times. So Apple's kind of staying away from these, and more recently they've kind of brought them on board. So you can actually install PWAs if you're on an Apple device. It seemed to be more of a Google Play on Android before that, and actually past that now, Windows is accepted them. So if they work just like they would any other desktop application, where you have an app that you have on your desktop or an icon that you can install. That's all.